She was tied to a tree in the freezing forest, left behind with her newborn pups and no way to escape. Days passed. The snow deepened. Her body trembled with cold and betrayal. But just when all hope seemed lost, something unbelievable stepped out from the trees. Not a rescuer, not a human, but a wild creature no one could have predicted. What happened next will leave you speechless. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know in the comments where in the world are you watching from. Now let's jump into the story. The air was heavy with silence that early morning. A soft mist crawled over the forest floor like a sleeping blanket, clinging to the tall trees of northern Alberta. It was winter, and the cold held everything in its frozen hands. Snow had fallen, during the night covering the ground in a smooth, untouched sheet of white. A single truck drove slowly down a narrow dirt road. Its tires crunched over the icy path as it weaved between pine and cedar trees. Behind the wheel sat Jonas, a man in his late 40s with tired eyes and a quiet face. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, even though the road was empty. He didn't say a word. In the back seat lay Maple, a golden-coated dog with the softest eyes. She had always been loyal, calm, gentle, and trusting. Even now, sitting in that cold seat, her eyes watched Jonas with love. Beside her, resting inside an old basket, were 3 newborn puppies. Their tiny bodies wriggled beneath a worn blanket. Their eyes still closed, their cries soft and weak. Jonas brought the truck to a stop near a lonely cedar tree. The branches above shook slightly in the breeze, dusting snow onto the windshield. He turned off the engine but didn't move at first. He just sat there, staring out into the trees, lost in his own thoughts. Then he opened the door. Maple stood and wagged her tail faintly. She didn't know what was happening. She only knew that whenever the door opened, it usually meant something good. A walk, a trip, maybe even a treat. Jonas stepped out and lifted the basket with both hands. The puppies stirred, making tiny whimpers. He placed the basket carefully near the base of the tree. Then he returned to the truck and took out a rope. Maple tilted her head. She looked up at him, still wagging softly. She followed him as he knelt down and tied one end of the rope around the tree trunk. The other end went around her neck. She didn't resist. She trusted him. Her tail stopped wagging, though, when he stepped away. Her eyes followed his every move as he returned to the driver's seat. Her ears perked up. Maybe this was a game. Maybe he'd return in a minute. He didn't look back. The engine started. The truck turned. Maple let out a low, confused bark. Not loud, just enough to ask, "Where are you going?" But by then the sound of the engine had already faded into the distance. She was alone. She looked around, trying to understand. The basket beside her shifted. One of the pups let out a tiny cry. Maple moved closer, curling herself around the basket, trying to block the wind. The rope around her neck was tight. She could sit, lie down, maybe take a few steps, but not enough to walk away. The wind picked up. Snowflakes began to fall again. The hours passed slowly. The sky stayed gray. Maple didn't bark again. She stayed as still as she could, only moving. When the puppies needed warmth or when the cold became too much to bear, she shivered, not just from the freezing wind but from something deeper, a sadness she couldn't name. A feeling she'd never known. Betrayal. Even as darkness began to fall, she didn't try to break the rope. She just lay there, wrapped around her babies, her body stiff with cold and confusion. Then, somewhere in the woods, a sound, a rustle, a crack of snow under heavy feet. Maple lifted her head. Her ears twitched. Something was out there. She could feel it. From between the trees, shapes appeared, slow, steady, and silent. A family of black bears stepped out from the shadows, huge creatures with thick coats and calm, quiet eyes. They moved with the grace of something that belonged to the forest. Maple didn't move. She didn't growl or bark. She just froze. The biggest bear, an older female with a scar over one eye, stepped closer. Maple lowered her head, pressing against the ground in a silent act of surrender. She waited for the end, but it didn't come. The bear sniffed the air, then stepped near the rope. She paused, then slowly began to bite at the thick knot around the tree. Her teeth worked carefully, not wildly. Biting, pulling, chewing. Minute by minute, the rope began to fray. Maple stayed still, hardly breathing. The puppies whimpered, but she didn't move. And then finally the rope snapped. Maple was free. She didn't run. She didn't bark. She just sat there stunned, unsure what to do next. The bear stepped back. The two mothers looked at each other, in the stillness of the falling snow. Neither made a sound. There was no fight, no fear. Just a strange, quiet understanding. The forest, it seemed, was not only full of danger, it was also full of surprises. And this was just the beginning. The wind had settled, but the forest remained still, almost holding its breath. Maple stood frozen, her eyes wide as the family of black bears lingered just beyond the cedar tree. She didn't bark. She didn't move. Her muscles were stiff from the cold, but also from fear. These were not creatures she had ever been close to before. The scarred bear who had chewed through the rope didn't come closer. She just watched. Her eyes were dark and deep, filled with something Maple couldn't quite understand. Not anger, not hunger, just calmness. The two young bears behind her, smaller and more curious, peeked out from the trees. They sniffed the air, then playfully pawed at each other, making little huffing sounds. The mother bear let out a low grunt and the cubs stopped. She wasn't here to play. Maple slowly lowered her body to the ground again, curling herself around her puppies. They were restless, their tiny paws twitching in the basket. One let out a soft squeak. Maple licked its head gently and tried to ignore the powerful creatures watching her. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, the bears turned and disappeared into the woods. Maple didn't follow. She was too tired, too unsure. Her body ached from the cold, and her thoughts were still tangled in the memory of Jonas, the man who had tied her here and driven away without a glance. The next day, the sun rose weakly behind the clouds. The snow didn't stop, but it fell, gently now, more like drifting feathers than frozen knives. Maple stood slowly. Her legs shook, but she stayed on her feet. She needed to find food. Milk for the puppies was not enough anymore. She stepped carefully through the forest, leaving the basket beneath the tree. Her nose twitched. She sniffed for anything, berries, leftover scraps, even buried nuts. But there was very little in the frozen landscape. Then she smelled something familiar. The bears. Their scent led her along a narrow path through thick trees. She followed, unsure why, until she reached a clearing. There, beside a fallen log, were pieces of a half-eaten fish, and near it tracks in the snow. Fresh ones. Maple didn't dare touch the food, but she lingered nearby. She waited, and as the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the bear family returned. This time, the young bears ran ahead. They stopped when they saw her, their heads tilted in surprise. The mother came last. She stood taller now, and the scar across her eye looked even more serious in the daylight. Maple crouched low, ears flat. But the bear did not growl. Instead, she walked to the fish remains and pushed a small piece toward Maple with her paw. Maple blinked. It was a gesture so simple, yet it meant everything. Cautiously, Maple stepped forward and picked up the fish. She backed away quickly, her tail tucked, but she didn't run. She returned to her puppies and dropped the food beside them. She didn't eat it herself, not yet. They were her first thought. Over the next few days, the bears returned often. They never came too close. They never touched the puppies, but they shared food, fish, roots, even frozen berries, and they kept their distance with a strange sort of respect. Maple stayed near the cedar tree, protecting her pups. But when she needed to search for more food, she often found signs, half-dug snowbanks, fish bones, or paw prints that led to small meals. She began to realize she wasn't alone. At night, she would sometimes see the bears resting nearby, curled up beneath the trees. Their heavy breathing was slow and deep, almost comforting in the silence of the woods. Her pups grew stronger. Their eyes opened. They started to walk, clumsy and slow, but determined. One of them barked for the first time, a high-pitched squeak that echoed strangely in the trees. Maple watched them with quiet pride. Each day they grew a little braver. As the days turned into weeks, a routine formed. The bears lived on one side of the woods and Maple with her pups on the other, but their paths often crossed. They moved together, but not as one family. More, like neighbors who understood each other's silence. There was no growling, no chasing, no stealing, only peace. And while Maple never forgot what Jonas had done, how he had walked away without a word, she began to understand something new. The forest had taken her in, not out of pity, not out of kindness, but out of shared survival. The scarred bear, who she began to think of as the watcher, had chosen not to harm her. She had chosen to help. And that simple choice without words or reasons had changed everything. Maple looked around the snowy woods and knew she was still afraid of many things. But here, surrounded by trees and strange protectors, she had found something she didn't expect. A second chance. 5 long winters had passed. The forest hadn't changed much. The trees still stood tall and proud. The snow still came early and stayed late. The cold still bit through bark and fur. But under that familiar silence, something had changed. Maple had. She was no longer the quiet, confused dog curled beneath a cedar tree. She moved with steady steps now, her fur flecked with gray, her gaze sharper. Her 3 pups, once small and helpless, had grown into strong young dogs, playful but alert, each with their own personality. They stuck close to the land that had kept them alive, learning its sounds and secrets. The bear family still roamed nearby. The watcher, as Maple now thought of her, had grown slower, but remained strong. Her cubs had become adults themselves, sometimes wandering off but always returning. Their connection was never loud, never close, but it was steady. They shared space. They shared peace. But peace has a way of being tested. One bitter evening, as a snowstorm rolled in from the north, the wind brought with it an old scent, faint, almost forgotten. Maple was sitting near the edge of the trail that had once carried her away from everything she knew. Her ears perked up, her nose twitched. She stood slowly and sniffed the air again. It couldn't be. Far down the snowy path, deep ruts cut into the ground, fresh tire tracks, and beside them, a set of footprints. Someone was in the forest. It had been years since she'd seen a human up close. The few that passed through stayed far from this part of the woods, but this scent was different. It was familiar. It was him. Jonas. He wasn't the same man now. His hair was thinner, his beard scruffy. The lines on his face were deeper. His shoulders sagged with weight that wasn't from the bags he carried. His truck had broken down earlier that day on a frozen road he hadn't driven in years. With no signal on his phone and night falling fast, he'd followed the trail into the woods, hoping to reach an old ranger shed he remembered. He hadn't meant to come back here, but something had led him down that path again. He walked slowly, the snow crunching under his boots. The wind howled between the trees. He pulled his coat tighter and glanced around nervously. Shadows moved between the branches, and then he felt it, that strange feeling you get when you're being watched. He stopped. His breath hung in the air. "Hello?" He called softly, his voice half swallowed by the wind. No answer, but the forest was no longer still. From the edge of the trees, eyes blinked open, wide, glowing, silent. First one, then two, then more. Shapes stepped forward, large, slow-moving figures, black fur, heavy steps. Bears. Jonas froze. His breath caught. He took a step back, heart pounding in his chest. He had no weapon, no time to run. He turned slightly, but something made him stop. From between the bears, a smaller figure emerged, She walked with calm strength, her head held high, her tail steady. Maple. Her eyes met his. He fell to his knees. Maple. He whispered, tears forming in his eyes. You're alive. She didn't move closer. She didn't bark. But her gaze didn't waver. Jonas placed a hand to his chest. I'm sorry, he said quietly, the words trembling as they left his mouth. I don't know why I did it. I was lost. Scared. I thought leaving you would fix things, but I was wrong. So wrong. There was no reply, of course. Just the sound of the snow falling and his own heavy breathing. The watcher bear stepped forward, her body towering above him. Jonas braced for the worst. His hands dug into the snow. He couldn't move, but then Maple stepped between them. She didn't growl. She didn't threaten. She just looked back at the man who had once walked away from her, and now knelt before her in the cold. Jonas looked up at her, tears running down his cheeks. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then, without a sound, she turned and walked away, back into the woods, her tail swaying behind her like a quiet farewell. The bears followed. Jonas remained on his knees in the snow, alone, ashamed, but somehow not broken. He knew she had seen him. She had remembered him. She had protected him. She had spared him. It wasn't forgiveness. Not exactly. But it was something. That night, Jonas didn't sleep. He built a small fire near the trail, wrapped himself in a blanket and stared into the flames, thinking about choices and second chances. And in the silence of that snowy forest, he made one. He would come back, not to ask for anything, but to give. The fire Jonas built burned low through the night. Snow fell lightly, dusting his blanket and boots, but he didn't move. His thoughts wandered through time, back to that day so many years ago, the rope, the tree, the soft eyes that never stopped trusting him, not even as he walked away. He didn't understand it back then. He wasn't sure he ever would. But now, sitting in the same woods with his past staring him in the face, Jonas felt something shift. Inside, not guilt, not fear. Something deeper. The next morning he made his way back to his broken-down truck. It took all day to get it running again, and even longer to return home. But as soon as he could, he came back, not with expectations, not to call her name or beg for forgiveness, just to give. Each week, Jonas returned to the edge of the forest. He never went far. He always stopped at the same old cedar tree, the one he had tied Maple to so long ago. There he would leave something, a bag of dried food, a small blanket, clean water in a metal bowl, and sometimes a piece of cooked fish wrapped in paper. He never stayed long. Sometimes he waited just a few minutes, sometimes an hour. Then he quietly walked away, never seeing anyone. For the first few visits, the supplies were untouched. But then one day the food was gone, not stolen, not scattered, just gone. A week later, the blanket had been pulled aside as if something had rested on it. Jonas smiled quietly to himself. He didn't need proof. He just needed to know she was still there, still surviving, still wild and strong. He kept coming. The seasons changed. Spring brought birds and melted snow. Summer warmed the trees and autumn painted them with fire. Each week, Jonas returned with his simple gifts and left them with care. He never crossed into the deeper woods. He respected the boundary between her world and his, and sometimes, just sometimes, he saw them, not close, not clearly, but from a distance. A flash of golden fur between the trees, a low huff from a bear, hidden behind the brush, and once, near dusk, 3 younger dogs running through the woods like shadows. One of them stopped, looked in his direction, then disappeared with the others. They were grown now. They were free. And that, Jonas thought, was enough. One day in early winter, as snowflakes floated gently down, Jonas brought something new, a small, wooden bench. He carried it carefully down the path, his breath misting in the cold. He set it beside the cedar tree, the very tree he had once tied Maple to and brushed off the snow. He sat down and rested for a moment. The forest was quiet, but not empty. He could feel it. "I don't expect you to come," he said softly, looking at the tree. "But this is for you, and for them, and maybe a little bit for me." Then he placed a smooth stone on the bench, a simple sign of peace, and left. Days passed. On his next visit, the bench was just as he left it, except for one small change. In the center of the seat where he had placed the stone was a pine cone. Not fallen, not blown by the wind, placed. Jonas stood still, a lump forming in his throat. It wasn't a message. Not really, but it meant something. Acknowledgement. Connection. That evening he returned home with a quiet heart, and from that day on he continued his visits, not hoping for more, just grateful for the bond that had been rebuilt without words. Maple never came to him. She never licked his hand or wagged her tail at his feet again. But sometimes, when the light was just right and the trees cast long shadows, he saw her, standing still among the evergreens, strong and wise, watching, not with fear, not with anger, just watching. And in her silence, Jonas found something he never expected. Peace. Because forgiveness doesn't always come in big moments. It doesn't need grand gestures or tearful reunions. Sometimes it comes in the quiet, in a pine cone on a bench, in a flash of fur between trees, in a choice not to walk away again. Maple had made her own life, one of strength, survival, and wild grace. She didn't belong to him anymore. She belonged to the forest. But even from a distance, even through silence, she gave him something he had never given her the day he left. A second chance.